and invite Viryanaya to launch us off.
Thanks very much, Amaragita. Yeah, well, it's good to be here. So I'll just say a little bit about myself and my experience and how I think that relates to our topic. So I've been teaching for many years. So foreign students, teaching foreign students English. I've been teaching at university level, A-levels. So mostly philosophy, religious studies, critical thinking, English, and also development studies, sustainable development, and that is links very much with the Eco-Sattva project. And I've also been teaching the Dharma at classes at the Buddhist Center, and when I was at college doing Mitra study, leading retreats at Taraloka and Adhisthana and so forth, particularly in critical thinking as a spiritual practice, which is my speciality. And I've done some Dharma input to the Buddhafield Festival teams, which was very interesting. So I've been reflecting on the differences between secular teaching in a formal educational setting and Dharma teaching. And obviously there's some overlap, but I think one key difference is that when you're doing secular teaching, it may be sort of 60% what you know and 40% what you are, who you are. Don't worry about that. But in Dharma teaching, it's more like 30% what you know and 70% who you are. So who you are is really important. Yeah. But of course, there's not a total distinction between those two. So Sangharakshita says the Dharma can only be caught and not taught. And I do think that is a very interesting observation. So it's not just about formal teaching, it's about encouraging people to catch the spirit of the Dharma. And we can do that in all sorts of different ways. When I was doing Dharma input at the festival, the Buddhafield Festival not last year, of course, but last time, there were a lot of international volunteers there, people from Hong Kong, from Europe, including Eastern Europe. And I was very happy to see them because I'm used to working with foreign students. But I did think, particularly the Hong Kong people, what are they going to think of Buddhafield? You know, this sort of chaotic seeming place with working in the kitchens in a tent. And my task was to bring the Dharma to this incredibly disparate group of people. But they really loved it. They really loved it. They really caught that spirit. So that was great. So I think key things here, which I've been thinking about, there's a useful phrase. It's not what you teach, it's what they learn. And I think that's very helpful. In that respect, we shouldn't think about what am I teaching? We should think about what people are learning. And that's learning in the widest possible sense, of course. So learning from knowledge, from example, from each other, from the atmosphere. And my English as a foreign language training has been very useful here because it teaches that what a good English as a foreign language teacher does is as little as possible. So it's all about you get out of people's way whenever you can. As soon as they can take responsibility, they do so. You provide the context and the support and the example, and it's empowering people to get on with it themselves. So we want to encourage really transformative learning, and that's subtle and it's uneven. So we set up the conditions, we hold the space, we step forward, we step back, we step away as is needed. So it's not about our ego, it's not about standing up there, it's about supporting people's development. So for me, the ultimate ambition of any teacher, the highest aim, must be to be superseded. Right? That's what we should aim at, to be superseded, to be able to say, now my student, my ex-student is better than me. That's what we need to aim at. Because if we don't aim at that, there's a decline over time. And this, of course, isn't to nullify oneself or put oneself down, but to be part of a great tradition that's developing and growing. So the Dharma teaching is relevant to address the question of direction, because I think more than anything else, it builds resilience in difficult times. So in current issues, we're living through difficult times, times of a lot of change and uncertainty. But if we can help with the Dharma to build resilience in people, that means instead of polarizing or hardening and separating, people can feel stronger and more flexible, and they can open up to each other and open up to the world. So I think for me, it's those two key things: to be superseded and to help build resilience. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Viryanaya. So we're going to now move on to Vishvapani for his take on the question. And I just thought maybe I'll put the question into the chat to remind everybody what it is. Yeah, so what makes teaching the Dharma relevant to today's issues is the question that we're in. Thanks, Vishvapani.
Okay, thank you, Amaragita, and thanks, Viryanaya. It's really lovely to hear that from you, all your years of experience as a teacher. And I'm going to speak in slightly different terms. I hope I'm going to answer the question, but we'll see. As well as all the things that Amaragita mentioned, I'm also a Dharma teacher. I've taught in Buddhist centers for decades, and I also write about Buddhism. So that's one part of what I do. My sense on the whole is that when I'm teaching in a Buddhist center, what I'm saying to people is, here is this world that we, the Sangha, create and inhabit. And you can come into that world. You don't have to stay. You don't have to sign up, but we invite you in. We invite you to learn what it is that we are practicing, embodying, sharing. And then there's something else, which is when we go out to people, not expecting them to become Buddhists, not expecting them to join our Sangha or affiliate or anything like that. And that's been very important for me. And I've always been interested in that. What do we have to say to the world from the basis of the Dharma? What do we have to say that really addresses the key concerns that people have? And on one level, that's about things like ethics and the relevance of ethics to people's lives. But you still need to find a medium. You still need to find the points where the two align. And the two main experiences that I'll be drawing on in my observations, what I feel I have actually learned over the years, over the last, particularly the last decade, is my experience of doing Thought for the Day, that's the name, Amaragita, which is, for those of you who aren't Radio 4 listeners, which is perhaps quite a lot of you. Anyway, it's a comment on the news from a faith perspective that goes out prime time on the Today program on Radio 4, and millions of people listen. And I've been doing this for 15 years. It's a job for life, really. And it's quite difficult because I'm not allowed to make party political points. I'm not allowed to make partisan points. And I've found that initially frustrating, but overall I've realized that it's actually a very, very good discipline. because who cares what Vishvapani thinks about Brexit? I mean, I've got my opinions, but they're simply as a citizen, you know, they're not particularly dharmic views. They're the views that anyone might have. Who cares what I think about Boris Johnson or even Donald Trump? Really, I have no particular voice on that, but I do have a voice, or rather there is interest in what someone speaking from my perspective has to say, if it's about the Dharma, if it's a contribution based on, you know, genuinely thought through Buddhist principles. And if it's a meeting point and not just a platitude, a genuine contribution. And the other arena in which I've explored something similar is in advocating mindfulness through an organization called the Mindfulness Initiative, which works with parliamentarians mainly, and Mindfulness Wales. I've helped set up a sort of a version of that in Wales, where we've got quite a strong collaboration with the Welsh Government. So again, we have to work cross-party. And I'm just going to make a little rant, a little mini rant here, because I often, when I am interested in politics, I am interested in these social political issues. And so often when I speak to Buddhists, what I find I'm hearing is a particular political viewpoint, usually a left-wing one. It's often one that I sympathize with, but it's not the same as really exploring together what the Dharma has to contribute to society, right? That means not using the arguments that you've read in the paper or you've seen on YouTube. It means not buying into a critique, even of something as significant as capitalism or neoliberalism, on its own terms. It means really trying to think things through on the basis of the Dharma, and that's the reference point. Now, that's all very well, but what I've what I've found increasingly is that the Dharma has things to say that people are really, really interested in. So this starts with the centrality of the mind within Buddhism, and everything Buddhism has to say about the mind, which is in some ways everything that Buddhism has to say. And the mind is interesting because everyone's got one, but it aligns with agendas around mental health, well-being, and then a host of other qualities that come out of that. So the meeting point specifically is mindfulness practice. So 15% of the UK population have learned and sometimes practice mindfulness, and another 35% are open to doing so. Those are the figures I saw recently. And that's quite a lot. It's a starting point. And there's a recognition in many parts of society that we need to get a grip of our minds. Now then, what does that look like when that's put into practice? And again, so I think it aligns with a lot else that people really care about. So there's a whole agenda around compassion. And this is not, it's there in organizations, it's there in education and the health service, but it's also a yearning of people who work in those professions, who work in those caring professions, to be expressing in their work the values that they believe in, which often are hindered by the organization, by the curriculum or the objectives that they're expected to fulfill. So there's an alignment there between the qualitative aspects of experience that that Buddhism can speak about, and what people really want. So there's an opening. And this is both on an individual level and in some cases on an organizational level. How can we have a more mindful and compassionate school? How can we have and this is a question that's genuinely being asked in Wales, a more mindful and compassionate education system. And so people who have some kind of grounding in those things over years of practice actually have a contribution to make, a very substantial contribution. Also, how can we get out of our narrow, instrumental, goal-driven mindset into one that really opens into and explores the long-term holistic perspective that the environmental crisis is asking of us? And that requires a mind shift. How can we make that mind shift? And that's where there's a resonance again with the practice of mindfulness. But you know, just sitting and feeling your feet on the floor and breathing is only the start. It's a way in to a set of qualities. And finally, and this may be something that's already been spoken about in another of these sessions, how can we have conversations in society in a way that doesn't polarize, that doesn't end up polarizing? And I'm going to say something that might be slightly controversial. Frankly, if we're interested in that, it's not really about lecturing people about nonviolent communication. It's getting interested in why people voted for Brexit and why people vote for Trump, and talking to them and listening to them and being open to what they say and not just arguing with them. So, you know, in all of these ways, I think we genuinely, there's a genuine resonance between what the Dharma is about and these needs in society that have come into consciousness. People see them, and there's a yearning for a more soulful dimension of life, a different way of living. And this is not just the kind of people who get involved with Buddhafield, who've always wanted that, but much, much more mainstream. And lastly, as well as that, people want to hear that expressed in traditional terms as well as secular terms. So just last week I did this Parinirvana Day. I did a talk on the radio about mortality, about COVID as an expression of old age, sickness and death, about the Buddha's dying words and the way he was, the way he bore himself up to his death, and everything that has to say to our society, which has confronted mortality through the pandemic. And people liked it. So anyway, that I've probably gone over time, haven't I? But those are my thoughts about what we have to say that people actually want to hear.
Thank you so much. That was beautifully spoken and lots of resonances. Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm in a bit of a dilemma now because Guyapati hasn't arrived back. Vishvapani had suggested
that he's not going to.
Yeah. Had suggested that I say a little bit because teaching and training is what I've devoted most of my adult life to, but obviously I haven't really prepared anything. I'm just wondering whether burbling in a rather unconstructed way will be better or not, or whether to just
Shall I ask you some questions, Amaragita?
Well, maybe you can ask me a question, but I just thought that I would pick up on something that you said, actually. So one of my first jobs that I had was I started a charity working with young people at risk, and it was based on a particular methodology that I recognized was very dharmic framework that we used. And what was really fascinating to me working with those young people at risk over a period of about 12 years, and also working with the probation officers, the social workers, the youth workers who worked with them, and also members of the community. So what we did on this program is that we got a lot of community volunteers, maybe about 50 or 60 people from the community, and we trained them. And then we worked with the youth serving professionals for these young people at risk. And then we worked with the young people. So we would take all three, so ended up about 90 people. We'd go on a residential, and in that residential, we would look very deeply at what was really going on with those young people. But what really struck me about that work was that often when I talked to the professionals about the young people, they would say, you know, they're really disaffected, they're not going to turn up, they're not going to, you know, they would just say all what they'd seen in that young person and how impossible it was to get through to them by all the means and all the training that they'd had up until that point. And so they were kind of very skeptical as to whether we'd actually be able to get the young people to come in, enroll in the program and take part in this whole, it was a year-long program. And so I was part of a team that went out and talked to the young people, and we invited them to a little workshop, a little presentation about entering into this, this program. And what we spoke about more than anything else was really, you know, what Vishvapani was saying about getting curious about your mind, getting curious about who you are, and, you know, what makes you tick, and why is it that even though you keep saying to yourself you're no longer going to bunk off school, you're no longer going to get into fights, you're no longer going to steal cars, you're no longer going to do all of those things, you say that to yourself, and you know that you don't want to do those things anymore, but you keep finding yourself over and over again doing those same things in the same rut, and you keep, and then you think there must be something wrong with you, that you can't actually do something even though, you know, you believe in it, you can't do it. And so why is that? So in the seminar, in the presentation to them, we would always really focus on them understanding themselves better and also them challenging themselves. So what we said to them is like, this course, if you, we would say something like, if you have, this course is not designed to be fun. If you have fun on this course, it will be by accident. You know, what this course is about you challenging yourself and doing things that you didn't think you could do. So if you don't think that you're up for that, please don't come on this course. We're going to have lots and lots of ground rules. We're going to have 3 pages of ground rules. And if you don't think you can keep them, well, don't come. So we created this sense of both a deep perspective on who they were, but also on them challenging themselves. And what shocked the youth serving professionals about this over and over again was that you could see that when we talked about who you are as an individual, and when we talked about them challenging themselves and doing things that they didn't think they were capable of, something would wake up in them. You could see this sort of like something would wake up, and against all sort of probability, you know, they would sign up to do the course. And the social was like, I can't get him to turn up for a set of keys that I've got for a new flat. You know, he's leaving care. I can't get him to turn up for that. How are you getting him to turn up for something that you telling him is not even going to be fun, you know, and is going to require, you know, something for him that is that, you know, he doesn't even, you know, has no idea of how he can do that. And what that gave me was this sense of that when we address the things that really matter to human beings, something wakes up in them. And my sense of what we were able to provide over the course of that residential, where they met people from their community willing to volunteer for a year just to support them and see them through a sort of transition in their life, when we also engaged those professionals in those same conversations about who they were and what was limiting them and how they could be honest about their experience of life, when we actually had those conversations, what people all of a sudden did was they met on their basis of their common humanity, their emotions, and their desire to make a difference, their desire to contribute both to themselves and to the community. So my sense is when over the last 30 years, I've been around schools, and I've been around, my work takes me a lot into universities at the moment, and I see a lot of young people, and there is a lot of the time, what I'm really struck by is that there is a kind of, somehow education has, not obviously everywhere, but I'm struck by how it seems to, in my experience, have gotten to the stage where there is not as much light, that kind of quality of waking up and being interested in what is on offer. It just seems to be, I mean, and it's got lots of different reasons for it, but there just seems to be a lack of offering of something that feels relevant and significant to young people. And often they are just glazed over, cynical and bored, even though, there is so much of interest, in my opinion, in life. But, often the education system isn't actually allowing that to be met. So this whole business of wanting to bring more, soul, something, I think Vishvapani used that word, soulfulness, but also just interest in who we are as a human being. I think that, my training as a Buddhist helped me to engage in that way. And I feel that, if anything, that is what, when people come to, different events, Buddhafield or retreats, or there is something in the human spirit that actually wants to grow and to develop and to talk about the things that are actually really relevant. So that's what I would really like to see more of, because having the conversations that matter, is something that I think will support young people to feel more confident about themselves, more resilient, enable them to communicate better and form the kind of bonds, the sangha, the community bonds with each other, because they're able to talk about real things with real people, about things that, where they feel pain, what their dreams are. And it just feels like there needs some sort of correction needs to be made about what education is actually for. What are we really educating people for? And of course, as Buddhists, we know what our answer is to that, but we don't have to impose our answer. But just by, for me, asking questions is a very powerful practice, and engaging in conversations. And that's why, this sort of focus on Eco-Sattva is both something practical and, a vision of a place where we can develop our interest in these 4 areas, but even more so going to different, whether it's, universities, or whether it's Buddhist centers, or whether it's different places, and saying these 4 things we think are really important, and we'd really love it if we could engage together in conversations that open something up, rather than just keep people set in their particular camps and little bubbles. And so that's why, conversations, having these living bridges conversations, both internally within the Sangha and also reaching out to, contemporary issues in the world, sort of outside the Triratna bubble, is something that Eco-Sattva wants to sort of engage in and do more and more fully. So that's me.
Yeah, I just, if I may, Amaragita, that's great to hear. I'm just very much reminded of a particular student I had at college, where I do think we were able to do that within the education system. And this was something called extended project, which I used to teach, where each student chose their own topic and they developed their own idea with some support. And this particular girl, I called her the fragile artist. She had very fragile mental health. Halfway through the course, she ended up in hospital through suicide attempt. So it was always a question of whether she was actually going to come into class, and if she didn't, why didn't she? But her project was to paint, and she was painting pictures of her mental states. Mm. It was incredibly hard to sit there and hear her speak about them. But I felt this was so important for her to be able to do that. And she'd tell me that she was trying to get the precise shade of silver gold that a scar showed on your wrist when you'd cut it. And it had a particular colour, and that was the colour she wanted to capture. And it was, we did wonder, me and the other staff, if she should be doing this project. There was a question of, were we taking too much of a risk? But we felt that, you know, with a lot of support and care, and that actually, she really needed to do that. And she did a whole series of paintings, and she succeeded, and it was wonderful. I must say, it was wonderful. I'm not sure I could have supervised her if I hadn't had a strong Dharma practice. But I think that the key point for me was that we were exploring for her just what you've said, Amaragita, which is something totally personal, totally what is happening for me, but it's met and held in a space that was quite challenging. You know, it wasn't easy for her at all, but was kindly and supportive and meaningful and personal. And that, for me, those key qualities in any form of teaching, you get this even in Mitra study, that people can be really challenged. It can be really upsetting, but they're opening up and they're connecting, and it's meaningful if we can provide that positive, non-judgmental space, that holding. Yeah.
So yeah, any cross-panel questions to each other or additional things people want to comment on?
Well, I was just going to comment. I mean, firstly, Amaragita, if that was you burbling, then I'd like to hear you when you've actually prepared. Or maybe you're better burbling. I don't know. But it was very interesting hearing you talk about that project of yours. It did put me in mind of, I've done quite a lot of work with men on probation and in prisons, and I don't do it anymore. And I wouldn't go back to doing it. And the reason is that I think what you had was the capacity to create a separate space, right? You weren't just going into a youth offender institution or something like that. And, you know, going in once a week and then leaving again. You created your own space, and everyone was part of it, including the the probation officers and so on. And I didn't have that when I was going into prisons and working with men on probation. And, you know, while I could tell stories about wonderful things that happened, it always felt a bit hit and miss. It felt like if it was the right person in the right mental space, then then they really resonated. But it wasn't, but it really needed something much more holistic. And I didn't have the levers and the criminal justice system is hard to work in because it's all about control and there's no money and there's so many attitudes and all that. So I just thought that was really interesting, that, you know, about making a contribution to society and being realistic about what you need in place before it can make a real difference. And it isn't just going in, however many years of practice you have, you know, into a situation that's set up wrong, which I think I've done rather a lot.
Yeah, it kind of strikes me that, you know, part of, you know, Viryanaya was talking about the international volunteers that have been coming to the festival for the last few years. And I think that is a situation where for 5 days or 10 days or 30 days, whatever, you know, the setup and the tap down, you know, even though it may be raining and we may, you know, be all held together with bits of tape, whatever, there is that immersion into a community with values, and you begin to sort of feel that, and maybe that's part of the appeal, that even though, but again, it has that element of a challenge. And I think, you know, there's something about ways we're making it easy in ways that it shouldn't be easy, but not actually, you know, trying to make it too safe. And I think human beings, you know, don't thrive always on everything having to be safe. You know, I think part of what we need to do is, you know, we rise to the occasion when there's a challenge, when there's something to do that's bigger than us, rather than everything being safe and easy.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, on the meditation retreat at Taraloka at New Year, which I'm usually on when it's running, we have meditation, you know, people go into silence. We have meditation reviews. And I've realized over the years that what's really important is that people have the opportunity to really fall apart in that silence, so they can really open up and really let go. And it's really scary, but there's someone there to talk to. It's not a safe space in the sense of there's no danger. It's safe in that you're held, yes, but you have to let go to really reap that benefit. It's a real challenge for a lot of people. Yeah. So I think with Eco-Sattva, you know, we want to create a really welcoming space, a really positive space, a really health space, but not a safe space in the sense there's no challenge, there's nothing that's difficult there. I mean, there'll be difficulties. Yeah.
Should we open it up?
Good idea.
To everyone else.
Yeah, let's have 15 minutes before the break. So is there any questions or any comments that
Amaragita, it's Mary here.
Hi, Mary.
From Liverpool. I'm just really inspired to hear all the panel, because I worked as a social worker for over 46 years. And so I've worked with a lot of disenfranchised people, people who've been very isolated in many different ways. And one of the things that I did just immediately prior to going into social work, I worked in a housing cooperative, and we got a group of people together who were living in dire, you know, conditions, and the houses were about to be slummed and, you know, put down, and we put a housing cooperative together. Now, a lot of these people were really at each other, you know, it was a very risky situation. And what we did, we put together a training team, and we taught them, one, how to be, you know, how to be treasurers, how to be this. And we formed a cooperative based on the old cooperative, £1 a share. And we gave them a focus, a meaning of how their lives would be. I was on the design subcommittee with the building, with the architects, and we actually built the houses. And, you know, it was fantastic to see the creativity, but also, I mean, don't get me wrong, there were times when there were huge arguments, but the way in which people actually engaged and supported each other, it was marvelous to see, you know. And I mean, I've had to go into youth offending and everything over the years, you know, so I know a lot about how volatile it can be, but it was to see the end result of that was fabulous. So what you've all three of you just described, in the way in which you've held people, but also allowed, and yet it could have gone one way or the other, but when you look at how the Dharma takes up that flag and runs with it with such wonderful energy and a very positive way, it's great. So I'm really inspired to hear this talk. It's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Thank you. Joshua has his hand up. Yep.
Hello. Yes, thank you for your thoughts, everyone. Again, my notebook is full, but I have a question for Vishvapani, because I was really interested in what you were saying about speaking in a non-partisan way. And I run in a lot of circles that tend towards the left side as well. And it's interesting, in these circles, there's really an intolerance for even considering opposing arguments. And I don't always feel safe suggesting, even if it's something I agree with, suggesting that there is a different opinion, or saying, okay, well, people say this, what would you say to that?
Yes.
Is there a way to work with that kind of intolerance, I guess?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in terms of the discussion, the framework that we're talking about is the Dharma. Now, and I do think that we need to practice with each other rather than agreeing with our Buddhist friends about our left-wing views. But it sounds like that isn't your framework. It's you don't have a reference point of something which is non-political, but still a source of values. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. It's not my experience. I don't really want to speculate, but obviously it's got to be meaningful to people. So there's got to be a reason for people to consider what you're thinking about. I mean, I just know for myself, when I'm in that sort of conversation, there's an element of me that gets bored when we're agreeing with each other on the basis of assumptions that we're not really interested in looking at or talking about. But how you do that, I don't know, I just argue with people. It doesn't seem to...
Yes.
I'm not advocating that.
Can I respond there?
Yeah, go Viryanaya.
Yeah. Years of teaching critical thinking A-level in colleges. Now that's very interesting, because critical thinking is about arguments. Yeah, that's what you're teaching people to do: how to argue well, how to question their assumptions, how to look for evidence. And obviously it can get quite lively. So I think if people have the skills, that's really helpful. But also it's that framework of courtesy, which I was very concerned to set up, that whatever our views, that's fine, but we need to be courteous, we need to listen to each other. And we always need to consider the other point of view. Now, in a way that's easier in a classroom, because I could set up the situation. It's harder in other circumstances, but there are certainly ways of doing that. And when I teach it in a dharmic context, I mean, we always start with metta, always start with metta. With my students, sometimes I would say, right, we're going to have a debate. Put up your hand if you're going to be for or against. And the students would say, but I don't know, what are we debating? And I said, I'll tell you that later. So they had to just go for the for or go for the against, and then had to swap so they could see there were two sides.
Yeah. Actually,
can I just, because I think I've got something to offer. So one of the things that I do is when I teach is about teaching about communication. And one of the things I feel that we really lack is enough distinctions in our communication, because communication can just open things up or it can just shut things down. And I think that one of the things that we can be really clear about is that there's these different levels of conversation. So one level is where we're just doing a sort of, it's almost like a ritual, casual. There's no intention in the conversation. I say boo, and they say behind you. We're just sort of following some sort of preordained spiel that we've got in our heads, and there isn't any commitment to anything else. And I think in those conversations, when it's like that, and there's nothing at stake, there's no purpose for why you're having the conversation, then you're just at the mercy of that kind of, that's just what you do. It's just like being in a football pitch where there's chants and there's boos and there's hoorays, and it's all happening on cue, but it's very automatic. And I think in that you just have to say, well, this is just the way this is, and I can't intervene in this on these terms. But what you could do is you could say to someone, I'd be really interested in having a different kind of conversation. I'd be interested in having a conversation where we looked at this question and how this question might be helpful to me when I go to the office, or me. So if you can create a framework for the conversation you'd like to have and invite people into it, then I think you stand a chance of being able to have the kind of conversation you want. So I think it's really important to, when I teach, there's these 5 different kinds of conversations that we distinguish out as the kinds of conversations you can have, and that you're clear when you're in one conversation. You may not like it, you may not want to be in it, but it's a bit like Vishvapani. It's also, well, I just argue, because that's just, you're in the arguing thing, and that's okay, but it's only not okay if there's something else that you want. Like, what I really want is to get to know you better, or what I really want is for us to find a solution to X, or what. So as soon as you bring in a clarity of purpose for the discussion, and you're able to articulate that and invite people into that conversation, say, would you be interested in having this kind of discussion? And they might well just say no, and you're like, fine, okay, well, let's just continue going, boo, hiss, boo, whatever. Or you can walk away and say, well, I'm not really interested in having that kind of discussion for whatever reason. So for me, that's the key, is being clear on what kind of conversation you want to have and what's it serving, and articulating that.
I do have another thought, and this is, I'm not going to start arguing with you, Amaragita. And actually, I have got better with this, and it's because I've recognized that with this sort of these issues, it's about rethinking the issues in terms of the Dharma. So, for example, I got very bored with discussions about Brexit, where we were all left-wing people who thought it was terrible. And the reframing is not what should we do, blah, 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 because there's nothing we can do. It's rather abstract. But, I'm really concerned about how divided our society is over this issue. What can we do? How can we engage with this in a way that somehow gets to the root of that misunderstanding and disagreement? Do you see what I mean? It's still on the level of a political discussion, but it's a different question. And actually then, now an answer to that includes the speech precepts, whereas European trade policy doesn't correlate to the Dharma. Do you see what I mean? So I think that's the way that we need to learn to think these things through. We need to extract ourselves from the discourse that comes to us through the media and through our friends and through our prejudices, and find some, I don't think there are many people who really do this, actually. I think it's something we need to learn to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Anyone else has? We'll take one more question before our 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and see if there's anything else. thoughts or questions or your own experience about what makes teaching the Dharma relevant to today's issues?
We've got John asking a question.
Oh, sorry, I can't see you, John. Yep, go ahead, John.
Hello. Yeah, and hopefully I'm not being a devil advocate, but for me, it's more of a question of what the Dharma is. I believe that one of it's like all the words in Pali and Sanskrit, but one of the words is like a basket. It holds things, it holds the teachings. But then you have to ask, what are the teachings? Because you might have a different tradition to another. There's so many different, how many traditions of Buddhist teachings are there? There's so many. So for me, the Dharma, it's not, I haven't got a sacred book or a sacred set of texts. And someone who's read the Dhammapada could say they've read the entire Dharma, if you want to talk about it in sort of teachings and words. So for me, anyone that passes on kindness, mindfulness, gentleness is teaching the Dharma. Do you know what I'm saying?
Is there a question?
It's what's you've used the word Dharma, and what are you referring to in this discussion?
Well, I just think that if you want to practice the Dharma, then you need to have your version of it. You need to have your understanding of it, which might come from a tradition or a teaching, but if it needs to be, it can't just be everything. You know, it needs to be something. And I mean, I think the main reference point with the kind of things we've been talking about is the precepts. 5 precepts, which are, you know, therefore, I'm not saying that's the whole of the Dharma, but it's something that every Buddhist tradition would recognize.
Absolutely.
And if we're talking about society, then, you know, precepts, ethics, that's the realm we're in on the whole.
Yeah.
Although I'd add, I think, in our society, people have got interest in their minds, often because they're not working properly. And we've got a lot to say about that.
Wicked.
Yeah. But you've got to find what it really means at depth to practice the Dharma.
Yeah.
That's what you've got to contribute. And actually often the kind of different formulations, that's not so important.
Yeah.
You know, if I meet someone who really practices from a different tradition, I recognize that, you know? So that's the important thing, that it's real. It's not just an idea.
Yeah.
Me.
Okay, so it's 8:30, so let's have a 5-minute comfort break. And if you, as you're supping your tea or on the loo, if an idea comes to you, bring it back, and we'll see if there's any more discussion to be had.
I mean, look, thought for the day is a very specific thing, and it brings its own issues and its own difficulties. And they're often to do with the news changing in the course of the day. So something that seems uncontroversial at the beginning of the day becomes controversial by the end of the day. But that's it's not so much. I mean, so those things are quite specific, and you can't really prepare. You have to agree. The whole thing is very carefully controlled. You have to agree the subject with a producer that morning. It has to be something that's in the news that day or relevant. So if it's been in the news 2 days before, it may well be old news by the day you write. In fact, you're really looking ahead to what will be in the news tomorrow. And then write a script, 2 minutes, 45 seconds, and with a news anchor and then a faith perspective on it. I mean, this is quite an art. I have learnt it now because I've done 150 of them. But I think what's more important and what's more relevant is the kind of reflections that I was sharing about, well, some of those things work and some of them feel a bit tenuous or a bit platitudinous, like the gap, the jump is too big between, you know, in the news today, we hear about the latest coronavirus figures. Well, and now I'm going to talk about something that's completely Buddhist and seems like irrelevant. So if the jump is too big, that tells me that the resonance isn't there. But the reflections are around where do things resonate? Where is it possible to speak? And because I've done it again and again and again, I've noticed there are certain themes I come back to. And then really finding things that in society that correlate to the Dharma. I mean, I just mentioned one other thing, and this may be relevant to you if you have Eco-Sattva in Wales, which of course is the right place for it. So in Wales, there's a piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which says that everything the Welsh government do needs to be assessed according to a number of criteria, right, which are set out, and they're about the well-being of future generations. And, you know, that's about the long-term effects of a policy, the environmental effects, about community engagement rather than something imposed. Now, there's lots of challenges about implementing that, but that's been on the statute book since 2015. And that then creates a framework within which it's possible to have conversations with the government. You know, how can civil servants change their mindsets? Because generally speaking, the civil service, which is the government really, is set up to for the sake of continuity and not changing and implementing things that have, you know, through organizational memory. So how can they change? How can they adopt all of these different values? So that's then a conversation and an agenda. Yeah, so I think that's it. It's really identifying where the resonance is and then finding things that correlate to it.
I don't really know what you mean. I kind of know what you mean, but could you give an example of a resonance?
Yeah, well, for example, I think the work you did was a good example. The work you described, but well, it depends what level you're working on. I mean, in terms of the criminal justice system that you're working within it, you could draw out principles from the work that you described earlier on this evening that are lacking in the criminal justice system, about really respecting people as individuals, about seeing that they've got the potential to change, about the professionals being there as human beings and not in a role. I mean, there's a lot of interesting work going, and some in criminal justice, not so much in the UK, but in mental health, you know, using those sorts of principles, compassionate approaches to mental health. And then so that's the sort of there's a movement called compassionate mental health, which I work with a bit. And because there's an affinity, you find that there's things that you can contribute to it, and people want you to do things within it. Is this still too abstract? Or?
Oh yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for me, the key thing is finding a genuine question that you have that is gonna and having the framework of what you're seeking to do in a conversation, you know, seeking to bring about more understanding, or seeking to create connection, or, you know, so those are the two things I think for me is the you know, being able to ask a genuine question in the midst, you know, but that's quite hard because when you're already in that particular modality of arguing or of, you know, just saying platitudes or whatever, to kind of really stop and let go of that conversation and then cut and then find the question based on the resonance, I suppose, that's going to move the conversation, open the conversation in a different way, and have it be then generative and creative rather than just automatic and
this is going
boring,
back to
as you said,
about what Joshua was saying.
Yeah, just about how we have conversations and bridging those gaps, bridging the gaps between, you know, say you'll take on the Dharma in a contemporary issue, or, you know, it's, you know, where there's these two things.
Well, look, your realm is conversations. My realm is more mindfulness teaching. And so that is a point of contact. And I certainly think Eco-Sattva should take note of how much it resonates. You know, meditation resonates with people, you know, and there's huge interest in it. It just, you'd never imagine people, you know, we had a conference a year and a bit ago in Wales, and we had the First Minister, we had AMs, assembly members, we had directors of, and they were all enthusiastic about about mindfulness, you know. So that is another way in, and of course that can go along with things to do with communication.
Rose, we've got a question.
Yeah, yeah, this has been really interesting. Thank you to all of you. So I was just listening to you speak. I was just thinking, I'll turn my microphone up. It sounds like there's a lot of weight put on the individual to be able to kind of create those spaces, like particularly the example, Vishvapani, when you referred to that framework that Amaragita created in being able to work with those kids in that way outside of the kind of institutions that made that harder. So in a way, it's kind of, there's a lot of expectation on the individual to be creative enough, or to be motivated enough to kind of create that framework, or to have those conversations, and to kind of step out of perhaps what might be the norm of how those conversations were being had before. And it makes me wonder about, well, what is it that we could do about the structures? I mean, maybe that's something about modeling, or I don't know, but what is it that we can do to influence how it is that we interact, and what is the normal way of institutions function, all the rest of it. And I wonder, like, how, I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying, Vishvapani, about being partisan and the political, but I'm also wondering how far can you actually affect structures without somehow having to kind of meet up against policy and things like that? It's just a wondering, really.
Yeah, I think this is a big question, and a lot of people are struggling with that question. I guess, well, I you know, that my way in is often through this interest in mindfulness practice, and it's a starting point. You know, it's not the whole story. It does need to become, but it starts to introduce a sense of values into a situation. And there are other values there at the same time. And I mean, look, I think from my point of view, you do what you can. I think Amaragita's model of really being clear, if you're going to intervene in an organization, like really establishing the conditions that you need, I think that's really important. I think working with policymakers and all that, going from the top down, I think that's another way in. If you can manage it, if you can get that buy-in. And that's that. I don't know. That's the job. It's not like there is a look. There's a lot of research about how mindfulness has been effectively implemented in clinical psychology, and what it says is that you need two things. The places where it's worked, you've got champions who are willing to pioneer and set something out, but that's not actually not enough. They need the support of more senior people. When you've got those two things, then institutions can change. Now, there are people who will say you also need a whole different philosophy of how the organization works. And that's possible as well. I mean, I must say that's really beyond my experience. But there are people who do that work. Amaragita, I imagine, knows more about that than I do.
I think partly this is about energy, what you were saying, Vishvapani, that you need a champion. We need energy to keep going with this. And that's where the Sangha is really important as a reservoir of energy and support. So if you're taking mindfulness out into the world, or the Dharma out into the world, you need to have that wellspring of energy and support behind you, if you see what I mean. So this is the living bridges, really, between the Sangha and the rest of the world. So the bridge needs to have a foundation to put its roots into.
Mm.
Well, I'm wondering if we should just close with a few maybe 3 or 4 moments of just sitting together, just absorbing what we've heard and connecting with each other before we say goodbye for the evening, since we have a few more minutes. But yeah, thank you so much. That's been really interesting and a great conversation. Thank you, Viryanaya and Vishvapani, and everybody else who's shown up interested and engaging with this topic. And yeah, we just want to keep having more of these kinds of conversations and encouraging you to have these kinds of conversations with other people and sharing your experience of having those conversations, and feeling if any ideas come up about things that you'd like to do or you could do, or to feel that you can start something, or also just let us know what you're thinking and feeling and what your ideas are to do with these topics, and see how we can kind of, if it's possible to fold them into what we're already doing within the sort of Buddhafield Eco-Sattva project. So we just sit for a few moments, and maybe 3 minutes, and I'll just ring a bell at the end, and then we can just unmute ourselves and say goodbye. So just 3 minutes.